Now, good afternoon, one and all, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brian Burgoon from the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research in Amsterdam. I'm the director of the Institute, and I want to welcome you all to our next edition, digital edition of the Great Thinkers series, the series where colleagues from the university present the work of heroes and anti-heroes, great thinkers in our midst, whose work we want to summarize and share with the rest of the academic community. And we're doing that online for obvious reasons. And today we are going to be hearing from Vivienne Matthies-Boon from the Department of Political Science. I'll introduce her in just a moment. Vivienne is going to be telling us about the work of still living great thinker, Jurgen Habermas. And Jurgen Habermas is somebody known, I think, to many people in many of the social sciences. So I don't think I need to say too much by way of introduction. I do want to say something specific about his work, however, that touches me personally by way of introduction. When I was in graduate school studying international relations and political economy, areas that are not central to Habermas's work, it became clear that Habermas's work was nonetheless very important. And I learned that from one of my teachers, Hayward Alker. And Hayward Alker, the late Hayward Alker, a really important IR scholar, international relations scholar, who once had a brief correspondence with Habermas. This was back in 1992. And he also had correspondence with all kinds of other famous, important academics. But it was only the conversations with Habermas that he wanted to tell us about. And one time he saw it fit to put a little message that he had been sent by Habermas on his door. And it was a sign of how important Habermas was to him and to our academic community, so far away in disciplinary terms. But ever since then, I've been following Habermas's work. Of course, he's famous for his work within the Frankfurt School, very important critical theorist, critical social theorist. And we're going to hear about some of his major contributions today from, indeed, our very own Vivienne Matthies-Boon. Vivienne has been with the faculty for a number of years as an assistant professor in international politics, and her research focuses particularly on issues of trauma in major political struggles and political conflict and the aftermath of those struggles. So trauma and psychological well-being, mental well-being, understanding how that plays a role in our political life, understanding what we can do about it and take it seriously in our work. She's done this in her academic work. And she's done this also as, in a sense, as a teacher and activist, actually a teacher turned activist in the work that she did in the key role that she played in a sense, orchestrating the freedom of Rami Sidki a little more than a year ago, where it was really her work and commitment to her former student and fellow human being in Egypt that we see that kind of, that particular kind of action. It's very Habermasian, actually, and maybe she'll say something about that in her presentation. But right now, I want to give the floor to Vivienne. She's going to speak for 45 minutes presenting this work. We will listen. And during the proceedings or during her lecture, feel free to ask questions that I will compile, and then I will look through them and try to ask a select number of those questions to Vivienne so we can make this a little bit of a conversation. Ask those questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. And again, I will be curating the question and answers. But without further ado, welcome, Vivienne. Thank you very much for telling us about the work of Jurgen Habermas. Take it away.
Thank you. I'm first of all going to share my presentation with you. And yes. So it is a real honor for me to present to you the writings and the works and thoughts of Jurgen Habermas. He's a philosopher whose works I've loved, struggled, and mostly also fundamentally disagreed with at times for about 20 years now. And indeed, Brian said something about my work on trauma. Here I've actually also started to use Habermas's insights to look at what trauma actually means in political terms and in terms of political justice, but I can talk about that later. For now, I just would like to start with the fact that Habermas really is not easy. Even a befriended Habermasian scholar just this week cried out in, well, more or less agony, saying like, oh, his work is just such a pain. But it's also great. And that's what I want to convince you of during this talk. But first of all, what makes Habermas so difficult? One could say that first thing is his writing style. For someone whose sole focus is on communication, his writing style is quite frankly often quite impenetrable, particularly if you're not used to it. It often consists of long-winded sentences wherein concepts are not always made entirely clear, especially if you're not already familiar with his work and so understand how he uses certain concepts. Another obstacle is Habermas's interdisciplinarity. Where his work is primarily rooted in philosophy, it also requires you to engage substantively in different theoretical terrains, notably sociology, politics, law, psychology, etc. But perhaps most importantly is the fact that he's a system builder. His philosophy does not consist of standalone pieces, but rather is an integrated whole. And by that, I mean that his writings and the different twists and turns that he makes, they're basically often impossible to understand if you don't already understand the previous things he's been working on. And so really, in order to understand Habermas, you actually have to understand all of it. And that is no easy task, given the 2 points I mentioned earlier, but also the fact that actually his bibliography, when you just print it out, it constitutes about 51 pages. So Habermas, I would say, is not fit for sound bites or philosophical hashtags, which actually makes this effort of giving you an overview of his thoughts in about 40 minutes outright a challenging one, if not an impossible one, actually. But needless to say, I will then, obviously skip some of his ideas and cannot go into sufficient depth on others. But nevertheless, I hope that by the end, I will have convinced you that despite these hurdles, Habermas's works are not only worth engaging with, but also actually crucial for our time. And they're crucial because throughout his works, Habermas has actually worked hard to offer us a critical humanist philosophy of hope, namely the belief in the rational potential of humanity and a resistance to authoritarian thought and practice. And in this sense, I do believe he offers us some useful insights. But first of all, what constitutes actually a great thinker? Well, a great thinker is, of course, someone who passes the test of time. It's basically a thinker that regardless of your changing academic interests and political interests, you find yourself returning to time and time again. And a great thinker, I would actually like to regard as someone who basically comes around for dinner, who's a guest who comes around for dinner and never quite leaves, because there's always more conversations to be had. Perhaps sometimes rather frustratingly so, because you always find yourself reverting back to his work. But what does Habermas himself now actually say about great thinkers? He says that the lives of philosophers are not the stuff of legends. What they leave behind is at best a new and often enigmatic set of thoughts, formulated in a unique language with which later generations continue to struggle. Indeed, in our field, we treat those thinkers as classics whose works have remained contemporary for us. The ideas of a classical thinker are like the molten core beneath a volcano that has deposited biographical rings of hardened lava. The great thinkers of the past, whose works have stood the test of time, impress their image to us. By contrast, we, the many living philosophers, who are in any case more professors of philosophy, are merely contemporaries of our contemporaries. And the less original our ideas are, the more that they remain bound to the context from which they emerged. At times, indeed, they are no more than expression of the biography from which they spring. Now, this quote is taken from this piece called Public Space and the Political Public Sphere, the biographical roots of Two Motives in My Thoughts, which is a piece where he rarely actually commented, by which he commented on his biographical underpinnings, or something which he rarely does. And I believe that this quote is indicative of Habermas's own striking humility with regards to his achievement. Indeed, in his book just published recently on his 90th birthday, nothing less than 1,700 pages long and constituting a history of philosophy, He also actually refers to his own work as a rather unserious undertaking, despite what many would regard its magnitude. Rather than upping his own importance, he downplays it, and he is always interested in entering into debate and learning from others. Yet some have said that this humility of Habermas also stands in an odd relation to sometimes his rather unscrupulous adoption and indeed modification of other people's work so that they fit or help support his own theoretical framework. In other words, what we would in normal language call a straw man reading. But one explanatory reason for this is the sense of urgency that underlies the content of his work. Now, in order to understand this urgency, I would say we do briefly venture actually into the biography of Habermas's philosophical achievements, because I think they highlight some of the specific points as to why his work is so important. Firstly, Habermas was born in 1929 with a cleft palate, which needed an operation directly after he was born. And as he writes himself about this experience, this intervention awakened feelings of dependence and vulnerability and the sense of relevance of our interactions with others. At any rate, the social nature of human beings later became the starting point of my philosophical reflections. The cleft palate also meant that he suffered from a nasal articulation and distorted pronunciation, which actually made it difficult for others to understand him. This, he writes, made him aware that only when communication fails do we become aware of the medium of linguistic communication as a shared stratum, without which individual existence would simply also be impossible. We invariably find ourselves within the element of language. But perhaps the most significant event was the fact that he was born in 1929 and grew up as a teenager during the Second World War. Now, growing up in a middle-class family, he also actually became part of the Hitlerjugend as a child. And he explains how after the Second World War ended and how he became aware of the atrocities of the Holocaust, his world was entirely shaken. As he writes, overnight, as it were, the society in which we had led what seemed to be a halfway normal everyday life, and the regime governing it, were exposed as pathological and criminal. And so ever since this revelation, which exposed the illusionary nature of the social life and political life in which he existed, he has actually struggled against authoritarian and culturalist essentialism in political thought and practice. The murderous Nazi system was, according to Habermas, very closely connected to a rejection of the public use of reason. It comprised a manipulative descent into the irrational, where the mystical or esoteric celebration of the noble heroic subject or the cult of some particular folk or the people crushed the deliberative rational potential of the public sphere. His work is hence permeated by a deep sense of vulnerability of our intersubjective existence. Namely, that our existence is intersubjectively constituted and that the safeguarding of this existence requires us to strive for recognition and not the rejection of the vulnerable or the other, but rather that we need to safeguard their voices in deliberative institutions and democratic practices that are open to all. Now, Habermas in his works, I would argue, and he has himself also admitted, basically takes a position, particularly in relation to four philosophical influences. He, of course, relates to a lot more philosophers, but those are the four that I want to highlight here because they form the foundations of his work. Firstly, is a sense of deep philosophical betrayal, which was above all epitomized by Martin Heidegger's philosophical ontology and the philosopher's unapologetic support for the Nazi system. Heidegger's philosophy, according to Habermas, is dangerous because it devalued intelligence and rational deliberation for the spiritual, and it also replaced analysis with the mystical and employed esoteric notions of folkish authentic thought. It was also fatally linked, he says, to a heroic call to creative violence. But as Habermas says, what was really offensive was the Nazi philosophers' denial of moral or political responsibility for the consequences of the mass criminality about which almost no one talked any longer 8 years after the war. And so we also have to understand that it's this academic silence, and in fact, that many professors who previously supported just continued their work as if nothing happened, that greatly disturbed Habermas. The second follows on from this, I would say, and it's a strand that also worries him, which I would call philosophical regression, which takes three distinct forms for Habermas. The first is young conservatism, epitomized by the ex-Nazi philosopher Carl Schmitt, who basically advocates for a strong executive powerful state that Habermas fears crushes plurality. The second strand within this second strand is right-wing Hegelianism, wherein the free market is regarded as the natural progressive unfolding of the destiny of man that the state basically has to cushion through a fixed substantive cultural underpinning. This, of course, brings back notions directly also of a sense of Volk, of cultural essentialism, as well as technocratic reason that Habermas deems worrying. And the last aspect for Habermas is postmodernism. And this worries him because, taking their cue from Nietzsche's nihilism and Heidegger's ontology, he fears that they reject reason and take their flight into the aesthetic. That is, in their rejection of ground narratives and the critique of reason, they end up denying reason and making a performative contradiction, according to Habermas, because they have to use reason in order to critique reason. There's a lot to be said more on this, of course, but I'm going to leave it here for now. And then there is the last one, which is the philosophy of the subject, wherein rationality is reduced to monological introspection. So Kant is a quintessential example here, who, for instance, basically determined the transcendental conditions of the apperception of the object through a monological inward reflection by a supposedly detached subject. The subject then becomes abstracted from concrete relations in the world, and subjectivity and knowledge production are thereby detached from the intersubjective surroundings and the intersubjective relations, which Habermas deems worrying, because that, again, I would argue, is a sense of authoritarian voice, the danger that you project universalism of something that's actually particular. But it's not just it's not just Kant that is worrying for Habermas. Rather, it's also this notion of a macro subject that worries him. It is for this, by a macro subject, which basically means this idea of a Volk or a people writ large, as if it's one unitary subject. It is also for this reason that whilst he was inspired by Hegel's critique of Kant and his insistence that our subjectivity is manifested in practical relation to the outside world and in interactions with others, he's nevertheless critical of Hegel's later subsumption of this intersubjectivity on the absolute spirit, by which history basically unfolds itself. This means, Habermas says, that Hegel ends up repeating the philosophy of the subject in the form of a collective progression through history. Marx, he says, repeats this mistake, though he turns Hegel on his head by actually examining the concrete capitalist means of production. Marx also reproduces the philosophy of the subject, albeit through the sense of a society or a working class as a macro subject unfolding itself in history. And Habermas, quite frankly, is allergic to such ideas, as it ends up potentially subsuming the plurality of voices and existence and the complexity of existence. Now, the last trend that I want to talk about here is the philosophy of despair. In the 1950s, Habermas ends up at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School, which was a loosely connected interdisciplinary institute associated with a variety of scholars, including, but not only, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, etc. The Frankfurt School was deeply inspired, of course, by the Marxist goal of not just analyzing social reality, but also changing it. and distinguish on these grounds between what they call the traditional descriptive theory and a theory which seeks to understand and change social reality. They agreed with Marx then on the destructive tendencies of the capitalist means of production, but emphasized that actually we need to not just look at the economy, but also examine how the cultural, the social, and the psychological intersect, and how this forms, in a sense, a system of domination. An essential concept here, of course, is their sense, or is the sense of instrumental rationality, which they particularly also derive from Weber, which is a calculative action designed to attain a specific goal by the most effective means, which then results in reification, a concept they borrow from Lukács, which means the reductive solidification of social life. Now, Habermas, though, reading all of this and being involved in this institute, feared that the Frankfurt School ended up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In that they ended up, he feared, eradicating the critical emancipatory potential of reason as instrumental reason dominated their analysis. There was no space left for actual deliberative rationality. It left, so to speak, no light at the end of the tunnel. And according to Habermas, it meant that they took flight in a philosophy of aesthetics or aesthetic despair rather than liberating critique. Now, important here for our purposes is then to realize that this forms the background against which Habermas developed his own philosophical system. And Habermas, from all this, sought to basically maintain Kant's rationalism, Hegel's intersubjectivity, Marx's concreteness, and critical theory's emancipatory potential through his account of communicative rationality in his discourse ethics. A rather ambitious program, to say the least. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus on 4 main phases, I would say, in Habermas's work, chronologically ordered. First, I'm going to talk to you about the structural transformation of the public sphere. Then I'm going to talk to you about the universal pragmatics, phase 2. Then the theory of communicative action, followed by his moral and legal discourse ethics, after which I have just a few comments on his political writings. Of course, a Habermas observer would immediately note that I'm skipping many books and many important debates, but I have to do so for the sake of time. And I would love to enter into this when we have our discussion, of course. So starting with the structural transformation of the public sphere. This is Habermas's most historically concrete book, consisting of an analysis of the rise of capitalism and the bourgeois merchant class in 18th century Europe. He particularly analyzed the ways in which debates in Europe's coffee houses and literary salons facilitated the rise of a bourgeois public sphere and the formation of public opinion, wherein also the printing press played a significant role in particular. What arose was basically a public sphere, which was situated between the private realm of the home and the official realm of the state, and caused, he says, a revolutionary overturn in political self-understanding. Rather than merchants now being told still what to do by the state, they actually became to regard themselves as critical citizens who challenged state authority, and who were then capable of holding the state to account and regarding themselves as the authors of the law. Now, against the pessimism of the Frankfurt School, he thereby used this analysis to basically try and outline the kernel of rationality inherent in these public deliberations and debates. And Habermas says that here it is that we see the first manifestations of the rationality of debate, which comprises of these aspects: the disregarding of status as in this public gathering, as it was the best argument, the best rational argument, and not the identity of the speaker that was supposed to carry the day. Also, all topics were included, including those that actually were previously regarded on the monopoly of either political rulers or religious authorities. However, the problem, of course, for Habermas is that these critical rational potentials were short-lived and quickly curtailed, particularly through the rise of mass media, lobby groups, special interest groups, as well as increasing interventions by the state, all of which sought to intervene or manipulate the public sphere to their own self-interest, or with their own self-interests in mind. And the result was then a public sphere that no longer critically assesses the political and social situation, no longer challenges it, but rather feeds into this. And this then is what Habermas calls the refeudalization of the public sphere, which is basically the display of publicity in front of the people, rather than the people now participating in this, taking part in this. Of course, these writings have been critiqued, particularly for the idealist depiction of the bourgeois public sphere and the 18th century salons. Also, a noteworthy point is the privileging of bourgeois cafes over working class pubs, so to speak, as well as, of course, the distinction it draws between the private and the public realm, which, as we all well know, and or at least should know, has been criticized by feminist scholars for being grossly inaccurate, because the personal is political. Now, skipping a large section of Habermas's works here, I want to actually move straight to his universal pragmatics, which is the foundation of his theory of communicative rationality. His universal pragmatics is also accompanied by a theory of social evolution, but I'm going to do myself a favor here and basically ignore it until I get to the theory of communicative action, where he basically draws on this when he develops his theory of modernity. Now, drawing on still speech acts, Habermas argues that basically when we enter into rational debate and make an utterance, its validity is evaluated by the hearer against the three domains of objective truth, normative rightness, and personal sincerity. And this basically means that anything that we say is evaluated against the realm of the outer world, is something objectively correct. The social norms, intersubjective social norms which we live by, as well as the subjective expression. So, for example, a reader can refute a claim through a yes or no answer, Habermas says, on the grounds that is not objectively true, that ball is not red, that is not normatively right, women should not be paid less than men, and that is not sincere, this person is lying on me. And he argues that by developing such an account of speech acts, that he's basically reconstructing the performative presuppositions we all have to have insofar as that we enter into rational communication and try and reach understanding. Now, importantly, Habermas argues two things here. That because the hearer can possibly contest the speaker's claim with valid reason, the speaker has to develop a reflective relation to himself or herself, and to his or her social environment and the objective world. And so reflexivity is thus built into communicative practices. But also that rational speech has a quasi-transcendental structure. For while the speech act is located in the here and now, it always makes a claim to universal validity, thus transcending the specific context or locality within which it was uttered. This is what Habermas calls the presupposition of the ideal speech situation. Now, he argues that insofar as that we want to engage in rational argumentation, we necessarily have to presuppose the ideal speech situation, which stipulates the necessary conditions of rational debate and basically holds that, again, debate should be shaped by the force of the better argument, that inequality in debate according to status or participation should be eroded, everyone counts as an equal peer, and that no relevant arguments should be suppressed and all affected are able to participate. Now, Habermas, of course, immediately admits that the ideal speech situation is a counterfactual ideal or a regulative ideal, in the sense that it can never be fully achieved and yet nevertheless provides a thin normative standard for when we engage in rational communication. Now, in doing so, Habermas has not only detranscendentalized Kant, but also actually shifted critical theory away from a critique of ideology to a reconstruction of the presuppositions of communication. So he gave critical theory a distinctive linguistic turn. Now, skipping many books, and many insights and many debates, I'm going to move straight to the theory of communicative action, where we see that he builds on his earlier insights. He grounds communicative rationality firmly in the intersubjective process of reason giving, or that the speaker is forced to redeem the validity again of his speech act, of what he said, on the basis again of objective truth, intersubjective norms, and subjective sincerity, thereby reaching understandings about facts, social norms, and subjectivity. He also argued that the outcomes or results that are the consensus is arrived from such communication can take on a socially coordinated function due to the binding character of rational communication. And so communicative action for Habermas refers to the interaction of at least two subjects capable of speech and action who seek to reach an understanding about the action situation and their plans of action in order to coordinate their actions by way of agreement. When we engage in such understanding, we do so, he says, basically against the background of a life world, the background assumptions of how we believe the world functions that we've become socialized in. Now here he takes his cue from writers such as Alfred Schutz and Gadamer, who've developed this concept of the life world. And he uses their work to basically argue that the life world is an interpretive horizon for our communicative actions. And that as we enter into rational communication on a particular topic, it's a specific part of this life world that then becomes problematized in debate with others. So we find out that certain assumptions that we held are no longer valid, and we seek to come to a communicative understanding with others when we're trying to resolve this discrepancy in understanding. Now, Habermas insists that as modernity then unfolded, that more areas that were previously closed up for deliberation were now opened up. So, for instance, issues that used to be determined by religious or social dogma or habits are now open for debate. And this is what he regards as a positive aspect, the universalization potential inherent in modernizing processes, by which he argues it unleashes the universal tendency of communication, wherein we broaden our horizon and increasingly take into account the perspective of others through our communicative practices. Now, Habermas thus operates with a clear theory of modernity or social evolution, whereby drawing on the insights of Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, George Herbert Mead, amongst others, he argues that in modernity, we move away from simple kinship societies to increasing complexity. So his theory of modernity builds forth, as I already hinted at, his earlier theory of social evolution that he developed actually alongside his universal pragmatics, so his philosophy of language. And drawing particularly on the works and the psychological works of Piaget and Kohlberg, he argued that basically just as individuals develop from the limited perspective of a child to a broadened perspective of maturity, wherein your interpretive horizons are broadened and you can take into account the perspective of others. So modernity moves as basically forces to move from a pre-conventional state of simple kinship societies, tribes, families, etc., to a conventional state of modern society centered around the state, and indeed increasingly so to a post-conventional state of a post-national constellation typified or expressed by differentiation. Now, the advantage of this move is for him that it advances our communicative competence. It basically forces us to broaden the horizons, to subject more subjects to rational deliberation. And so for him, he says modernity has unleashed the universal potential of communicative rationality as more terrains were opened up for communicative debate. Yet the paradox of modernity is that its universalizing potential is also directly undermined by an increasing systematic rationalization or instrumental reason, which entails the calculative strategic pursuit of a predetermined goal through an objectivating perspective. So instrumental reason does not gear towards reaching understanding and does not take up the perspective of the others in debates when we adopt this approach, but rather it means that we instrumentally want to achieve a particular strategic goal. It's a means-end calculation. Instrumental reason for Habermas in this work is typified by the administrative power of politics and bureaucracy, as well as the economic power of the market economy. But it also still constitutes law. He says that when the systematic reason and instrumental reason of these terrains basically become increasingly autonomous from the life world, they start to operate according to their own functional logic. And in doing so, they actually start to encroach on our life world. They start to colonize it, leaving all sorts of pathologies in its wake. Now, as already hinted at, so he originally changes his mind later. At this point, he still regards law as being driven by instrumental reason. He does still adopts a rather Marxist analysis of law here. And he bemoans the distorting effects of the increasing juridification of everyday life. For as the instrumental logic of money and power then starts to dominate and encroach on meaning-making practices, we are left with alienation, enemy, a distorted sense of self, and mental health issues that are left in its wake. So here we do see also Habermas's critically inspired motive. As he says, he wanted to show that one can develop a theory of modernity using communications theoretic concepts which possess the analytic precision needed for the socio-pathological phenomena, for what Marxist tradition calls reification. Yet the somewhat problem for Habermas is that actually our world is increasingly plural. We hold a variety of different ethical points of view. We hold a variety of different views about the good life. So one of the things that became increasingly untenable as his work progressed, action, that participants in debate actually shared a common life world, want to give up and definitely does not want to descend into the bottomless pit of relativism, and instead complements his idea of communicative action rooted in life worlds with the notion of discourse ethics. He argues then that in light of such plurality, we should try and seek consensus, not on ethical concepts about how one should live, but on abstract, general, universal principles, such as thou shalt not kill. We thus reach understanding and achieve civic integration through the consensus on higher, more abstract moral norms, whilst leaving the thicker conceptions of the good about how we should live, what we regard our identities, up to the lives of individuals themselves. For Habermas, a moral norm is basically a norm that can claim universal validity, that abides by his universalizing principle. And that is when all affected can accept the consequences and side effects its general observance can be anticipated to have for the satisfaction of everyone's interest. And those consequences are preferred to those of whom alternative possibilities, alternative possibilities for regulation. So this is his universalizing principle. But for Habermas, it's not enough to just think that this is how norms ought to be then established, because actually what we have to be sure of is that we don't determine such norms inside the philosopher's head or inside the scholar's head, but rather we have to agree upon them through actual discursive deliberations. And it is for this reason that he then supplements his universalizing principle with his D principle, his discourse principle, which holds that only those norms can claim that can claim to be valid, that meet or could meet with the approval of all affected in their capacity as participants in actual practical discourse. Now, there are three important things that I think we have to realize here when we talk about his moral discourse ethics. And first is, Habermas is not interested in the question so much as to why we ought to be moral. He explicitly brackets this question, and instead insists that insofar as we want to solve matters discursively, we ought to engage in rational moral discourse. And secondly, Habermas argues that he grounds his discourse ethics in the thin presuppositions of rational debate, and thus argues that whilst his moral philosophy is philosophically cognitivist in the sense that it admits of truth, universal truth, it is not a substantive program. He merely outlines the thin presuppositions, he argues, that we have to presuppose when we try and reach a moral norm. But he doesn't actually substantially tell us what such a norm substantively entails. And he also argues that he offers us what he calls a post-metaphysical, so not a transcendental, and a fallible account. Because any norms that we might come to agreement on, any universally valid moral norms, are always subject to revision, because debate on them may always be opened up again. Hence, they're not set in stone. Now, there's a lot more to be said on this, particularly also in light of his debate with Charles Taylor, a communitarian philosopher, and also the philosopher John Rawls, the liberal thing. But I want to skip this for matters of time. I don't want to, but I'm going to have to. And instead, what I want to turn now is the fact that Habermas faced two problems here. Firstly, whilst it's all nice and honky-dory to say we move from the discourse of basic justification and we see how moral norms are basically validated, we do have a problem when we try and apply it. It basically leaves us empty-handed when we then try and apply this norm in a particular context and a particular situation. It also leaves the aspect of the motivational will unanswered. The abidance to moral norms basically demands a strength of will that many might simply not have. It is because of these two problems, amongst some other ones as well, but these two main problems, I would say, that he then turns to law as his savior. And he complements his moral discourse ethics with a framework of his legal discourse ethics. Law, he argues, may coordinate social integration better because it's Janus-based. That is, in law, we the citizens are both its subject as well as its addressee or its author. Law, he argues, is both coercive but also discursively formed. And so with regards to the motivational problem, subjects basically can choose themselves whether they want to take an objective attitude or more or less sit back and just be the subjects of the law, or whether they actually want to take a performative attitude, he argues, and become authors of the law through the participation in the discursive formation of law. Now, he argues that since law fuses the social reality of the force of law, so the coercion that law has, with a normative claim to legitimacy, it is able to coordinate civic integration without reliance on thicker notions of identity and their imposition that would basically violate a plurality of worldviews. Habermas here clearly seeks to steer in between the sociology of law. He mentions Karl Marx here, Nicholas Luhmann, who emphasized the coercive nature of law as they saw it as a functional extension of the economy, as Habermas himself also did earlier on, and the normative accounts of justice, for instance, such as that of John Rawls, who he says are blind to its coercive application. Now, another advantage of law as a medium for social integration is that it enables us to build institutions. And he particularly proposes the development of a constitutional model based on a two-tiered model of discursive procedures, or what he calls a sluice model. This model distinguishes between the center of a political apparatus, which consists of the formal political sphere, and the sphere consisting basically at the periphery, the informal public sphere, both of which are dependent on each other and connected through the concept of civil society. Now, the informal sphere is basically where all everyday communications happen. This is where individuals communicate with each other, where they enter into rational debate, where also media basically has its role in terms of steering on these debates and listening to voices, etc. And it's mostly regarded, he says, as a more unorganized, organic social space where, and I'm quoting him now, he says, streams of communication are filtered and synthesized in such a way that they coalesce into bundles of topically specified public opinions. So here citizens basically enter into rational debate with each other. And these communications are then picked up by civil society, which consists of social movements and organizations that then bring the content of these earlier discussions of the informal public sphere into the center of the political apparatus, or the formal public sphere. Now, in the formal public sphere, he says, we find decision-making bodies, the authorities such as parliament, legislative and executive bodies that follow certain established procedures. It is here that the binding legal and political decisions are made, and thus where, he argues, will formation takes place. Since the political and the legal and the judiciary bodies are situated in this central realm, they cannot themselves discover the plurality of different views. They remain dependent on the informal public sphere and also the filtering through of these contents through social organizations. The outcomes of these debates, though, at the center of the political apparatus are then transformed into communicative power, he says. Basically, it's when the deliberations take on an institutionally binding force. This force and this communicative power is then moved into administrative power. It seems a rather complex system, but the administrative power is basically the moment by which all these deliberations then turn out into legislation, which of course then affects the subjects again, or the participants in ordinary everyday debate, who may agree, not agree, might be unforeseen consequences, etc. And so they feed their discourses up the ladder again. It's important that we realize then that for Habermas, his political model really is a model of a circulation of communication, where ultimately no one holds ultimate power. Now, in the last important point I also want to make here is that for Habermas, public and private autonomy are co-original. That is, for him, we cannot exercise our autonomy in the private sphere properly unless we also have public autonomy as participants in debates. And this, and I think it's an important point, requires not only civic and political rights, but also of participation, but also fair socioeconomic distribution when no one is marginalized. Hence, we need to steer, he tries to steer his way in between this idea of individual rights and collective self-becoming, and argues that actually our individual rights and our individual liberties and our capacities are dependent on our public rights and our capacities to participate as equal peers in rational public debate. You simply cannot have one without the other. They are dependent on each other. Now, lastly, I'm going to just say a few things here. Unfortunately, though, I don't have enough time to go into his latest contributions on biotechnology and religion. But again, I'm happy to do so also in the discussion. What I do want to stress here is that what is so distinctive about Habermas and great about him is that despite his complexity and the difficulty of his concepts and writings, etc., is that also he combines his philosophical role as an academic with one of a public intellectual. And he's put his theories basically into action as a participant in the public sphere himself through his interventions as a public intellectual. And he's done so on numerous occasions, amongst others, these are not the only ones, the nuclear debate, the student protests in Germany, the issue of German unification, the Iraq War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo intervention, etc. But also particularly noteworthy were his calls for a post-national Europe, where he advocates a form of European integration based on constitutional patriotism that is devoid of any notions of this sense of Volk, which would bring us back to cultural essentialism that he wants to avoid, but also avoids a technocratic reduction of European integration just based on the circulation of money and the economy. And instead, he tries to root it in thin, discursive, proceduralist integration. Now, of course, as I myself have also done in my previous writings, there's a lot of problems with this account. And indeed, there's two aspects of Habermas's work that I personally regard as the most problematic. Firstly is his theory of modernity. This sense of progression from the simple society to a more complex one is not only problematic in terms of the Westocentrism that's entailed in it in the sense of progression, but also actually relies on dubious research, dubious anthropological and archaeological research of kinship projections from tribes in Africa that then are basically projected back in time on tribes in our past. So that I would actually argue is a very problematic aspect of his theory. And in my own previous work and also in my forthcoming work, I actually argue and propose ways of distinguishing his account of communicative and discourse ethics from his theory of modernity and social evolution. And something, though, that unfortunately for me, he's also made more difficult in his recent book, A Philosophy of History. Related to this, then I would also point out his Eurocentrism, which I do regard as particularly problematic. But regardless of these two massive points that are problematic about Habermas's account, why is he then nevertheless so important for me and for us and for many other scholars? It's firstly, I would say, it's his emphasis on intersubjectivity. It's a sense of a great awareness of the intersubjective constitution of ourselves, of our knowledge, of our meaning-making practices. And his work is permeated with a distinct awareness as to how vulnerable we really are. Then also it's his application to other areas. We have seen a flourishing of the application of his work and his sense of fair, equal institutions in analysis of global politics, in the formulation of ideas of global justice. But also I myself have applied actually into a rather different terrain, and that is that of trauma, whereas like politically motivated trauma on human rights activists, in my case in Egypt, is basically an instrumental colonization of the life world, by which the violence and the misrecognition and maldistribution is so grave that it leads to disorientation and makes it impossible for people to effectively engage in their personal world, the social world, and the political world. But also, what I think is really important about Habermas's work is that in a seemingly irrational world full of deformities, injustices, etc., he urges us to nevertheless never give up our belief, in a sense, in the rational communicative capacities. Especially, this is, I regard as especially important, when this is also under attack by populist forces with authoritarian tendencies and the like. So Habermas's philosophy is important because it's actually also a defense of rational deliberation and the democratic rule of law. It therefore, I argue, constitutes a philosophy of hope. Hope in nothing less, actually, than just the ability of human reason, dialogically conceived. And it's for this reason also that I want to close this, this presentation basically with a quote of Habermas himself. which I think highlights the importance also of not giving up this philosophy of rationality in our role as scholars. He argues, intellectuals should make use of the professional knowledge that they possess, for example, as philosophers or writers, social scientists or physicists, on their own initiative without being commissioned by anyone to do so. They need not be neutral and eschew partisanship, but they should be aware of their own fallibility. They should limit themselves to relevant issues, contribute sound information and good arguments. In other words, they should endeavor to improve the deplorable discursive level in public debates. Intellectuals must therefore walk a difficult tightrope in other respects as well. For they doubly betray their own authority if they do not carefully separate their professional from their public roles. And they should not use the influence they acquire through their words as a means to gain power, thus confusing influence with political power, i.e. with authority tied to positions in a party, organization or government. Intellectuals cease to be intellectuals when they assume public office. It is hardly surprising that we generally fail to live up to these standards, but that in no way devalues the standards themselves. For if there is one thing that intellectuals, a species that is so often attacked its own kind and pronounced its demise, cannot allow themselves, then it is to become cynical. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing this now.
Now, Vivienne, that was really superb. I can say I personally learned a lot, and you did a terrific job of articulating some of the key moves in his intellectual development. And you raise a bunch of questions. I actually want to ask a general question that actually also gets expressed by Tarek El-Baradi. I'm going to ask you my version of the question, and then I'll read his. But it's really kind of the same question. And it gets at the issue of the challenges to the kind of communicative action, the kind of discourse ethics, the communicative ethics that he champions, and about which he has hope and is striving to promote these standards. I think we can understand those claims and that project as a mission, that we shouldn't give up on that in our own action. But it raises certainly the current ferment that we're facing, and I think probably his own past, thinking about his Nazi Germany childhood. He knows full well that there are circumstances where a big part of public space is dominated by people who are fundamentally out to destroy exactly those standards. So as an American who's just voted in the American presidential election, look at what happened in the debates where Trump kept his modus operandi was to distort and disturb any possibility of communicative action. I mean, it was an anti-Habermasian purgatory. And it's very clear that the medium made that possible. And more generally, social media is a realm where we know that a lot of echo chambers get created, targeting gets created that can circumvent communicative action. So then my question turns out to be the same as Tarek El-Baradi's. So let me read his question, but it's the same question that I have. How does Habermas judge social media in terms of its contribution to rational communicative action? And is this contribution, the contribution that it makes, or the undermining role, is this a dynamic that's going on and is likely to improve or deteriorate over time? So how do you deal with the kind of dynamics that we have now? How would Habermas deal with the kind of dynamics that are taking place in the social media and in current public ferment that you yourself refer to, the populist ferment, to actually maintain that hope?
Yeah. God, there's a lot to be said on this. It's a really, really extremely important question. There is, of course, a problem, and it's also a problem that, to be frank, I've struggled with myself as well, in that, what do you do if people don't want to participate in rational communication? Habermas is always based on the presumption that people want to engage in rational communication. So he only really provides us models for understanding what happens when people engage in rational communication, but not really any particular tools, I would say, of basically dealing with people when they don't want to engage in rational participation in debate. And this is also stuff I've previously highlighted in my own work on this as well. But I would actually add perhaps something else here, though, and that I don't think, and I'm now slightly into the speculative because I don't know what he would say to this question, but I think for him, if you look at his interventions in basically newspapers, opinion pieces, and also social media pieces, etc., is to always try and be rational in one's statements back. So he always tries and basically does his very best, as you also see with the last quote, to nevertheless the irrationality of debate and the poor level of it, to try and at least up it himself through his actual engagements in it, which basically means, rather crudely put, that when we are faced with the irrationality of others, we don't start shouting back, but we actually try and engage through rational argumentation. Though, of course, I mean, we run up against limits here, especially also you were, Brian, you were talking about Trump. I also have to immediately think of Egypt and Sisi's realm, where the public sphere is entirely closed. If you so much breathe the wrong space, you basically either die or end up in prison or whatsoever. So in these kind of circumstances, there's also a question about the responsibility. Who has the responsibility to engage in debate when actually the circumstances are so that it can also even, in some contexts, cost one's own life. This, of course, can only be determined by the person himself in these actions. I mean, Habermas would never, have sort of a blanket thing for this, but it does raise the problem that he does presuppose the ability and the capacity to be able to engage in public deliberation as such, and that these deliberations are mostly rational. In terms of social media, there has been, particularly in the 1990s, there was this flourishing of basically, I don't know, optimistic literature on, through the social media, we now see new public spheres, etc., emerging. This is the real rational potential. And of course, what we've seen instead are basically is the irrationality of Twitter, leading to a whole new form of populism and its destructive intents. I think in relation to that, Habermas would still urge us to, in a sense, never give up. Perhaps it's not good enough, but and not sufficient in such circumstances, but never give up striving for intersubjective parity, whereby we see others as equal. I hope this sort of answers. It's a difficult question to answer, but I hope this does.
No, that's very useful. We could go on that question a long time. There are several deep questions, but since you just answered a deep question, I'm going to give you one that is it's not deep. It's more that it's probably easier to handle. It comes from our colleague Paul Arts, who, after apologizing for his lack of familiarity with Habermas's work, I think he now knows a lot more than he did, just like me. But he has a nice anecdote that he'd like you to comment on. So sociologist Asif Bayat, this is Paul Art's writing, sociologist Asif Bayat once quipped, when analyzing modern day Iran during the presidency of Mohammad Khatami, that the president, quote, had read too much Habermas and Foucault and too little Marx and Gramsci, end quote. Is this a superficial remark, or might it somehow make sense? And he would like to know your comments on that brief site.
So just to get that right, so the president read too much Habermas and Foucault and not enough Marx.
Precisely, that's the joke. I mean, it's of course intrinsically humorous, but it's there's potential truth there.
Yeah. I mean, I think, to be honest, whenever you engage with Habermas, you will need to have read basically your main philosophy, and that includes also Marx. So I would actually, in response to this, he might have read too much Habermas and Foucault, but I'm not sure that without having read everything by Marx, or at least a good section of it, he would have understood much of it without that background. Because really that's the background that they come from. It's a bit like trying to understand Habermas without, understanding at least the basic main philosophies of Hegel and Kant. It's very difficult, and I think you lose a lot of nuances in his work. So yeah, I'm not quite that answers, but I would say that he might have read a lot of it, but not sure that he would have understood it without reading.
No, thank you. So now I'm going to ask you another question that has been posed by one of our audience members, Annette Freiberg-Inan, who's the Dean of the Graduate School. So Annette, first, thanks you very much for a great talk and so on. But here's her question. I'm just going to read it if I may. I wonder if you would agree that we can conclude that Habermas's positive expectations regarding what modernity would do for public communication were unfortunately wrong. And that moreover, the reason why the public sphere has become less rather than more constructively deliberative is not, as he expected, because instrumental rationality and problems with it, but rather the circularity of communication, she puts that in quotes, circularity of communication celebrated by postmodernism. Is it possible that that's the real problem? And indeed, you have explained that Habermas was critical of postmodernism, but arguably, perhaps, if this is true, not critical enough. And she wants to know your reactions to that possibility. So the circularity of communication might actually be super important, and the role of postmodernism as a sort of thought craft that champions such circularity might be really at work here.
Yeah, although I would like, but the problem is in this format, we can't really ask the audience themselves questions, but I'd like to know more about what Annette would actually mean properly with this idea of circularity of postmodernism, what forms it would take. Without that, it's a little bit tricky to answer the question. Because I'm coming from such a strong Habermasian background, I see circularity immediately in terms of the legal discourse ethics, whereby it moves up and down, the system. Whereas I have this distinct feeling that what she means is something very different. And of course, I'm very familiar with Foucault and Derrida, etc.
Well, but one way of, so my interpretation of this, we'll let Annette clarify this with you separately. And normally we would be able to do this live, but given the technology, let me give my interpretation of the question. So the circularity of communication involves, in a sense, a deeper version of the critique that Habermas himself made that you summarized in your presentation, namely that there is a kind of relativism to the status of different kinds of construed or created ideas in the construction of different realities that are taken as co-equal, that leads to a circularity in the interaction where my truth versus yours becomes very difficult to break out of. It becomes circular. That's one way I would interpret this question. Yeah. If that helps, then give an answer. If not, then we'll move to another question and we can talk.
No, this is useful because it's just that being so grounded in Habermas, you immediately think of circulation of reason as the legal discourse ethics, but this makes it very clear. And yeah, I mean, I think Annette might be right in that definitely poses a challenge. Though one could say that Habermas actually, this is what he does recognize entirely within his works. And it's also on this basis that he tries to establish a thin deontological system of legal discourse and moral discourse ethics that actually leaves the plurality in touch and says that we can nevertheless, even though we have all these different agreements, and so we'll never reach agreements on how we want to live and how we want to live our good life, so how we want to live, how we see our identities and the other values, that then we can nevertheless come to agreement on some basic, for instance, moral norms, or on a closer community, legal principles that we believe our community should be guided by. So the sense of thou shalt not kill, and then provide rational arguments for this or not. But of course, the it's all, in a sense, nice and hunky-dory having this in a theoretical model. Is quite something else when you're dealing with the basically with the messiness of actual debates. And particularly one of the things that, of course, Habermas has also been criticized for, and that I would agree with also with that criticism, is his basically the fact that he ignores the emotional aspect in communications in this regard, because when emotions run high, it's also very difficult to actually try and even reach understanding. And that, I think, then also contributes to that circularity that Annette was referring to. And I think that's an aspect that, for instance, Simon Thompson has written on this, and Nick Crossley and several others. And of course, I'm contributing in my own way in terms of trauma, but that's really an aspect that I think is essential also for our current circumstances.
Just to be clear, I think you answered the question well. What Annette meant by circularity of communication was no definite pronouncement on agreement, roughly as you also talked about it in your answer. So let me move to another question, if I may. There's an excellent question by Leah Lush. So after thanking you for your impressive summary of Habermas in 40 minutes, she writes the following. I agree with Habermas's optimistic attitude, but was wondering if he doesn't give up on them a bit himself by turning to law, because it doesn't seem to work otherwise. And she puts it differently. Isn't his turn from moral discourse ethics towards legal discourse ethics a sort of admittance that the former doesn't really work?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And the thing is that he argues that his moral discourse ethics doesn't work because it lacks that binding character. So people, basically there's no reason why people need to also stick to this. Whereas within a legal system, then that would work. But I mean, you could, in a sense, indeed regard that as a sort of a defeat. At the same time, I actually, maybe rather ironically, I regard his moral discourse ethics as much more tenable than his legal discourse ethics. And that is because his legal discourse ethics is still underpinned by this sense of modernity, whereas we can actually basically skin his moral discourse ethics from his theory of modernity and theory of social evolution, and keep basically a thin sort of a thin framework by which we can then have a critique of distorting practices, so by which communication is deformed. Whereas his legal discourse ethics still very much presumes this descent of, we move from the simple society to the conventional to the post-conventional, and really is very firmly rooted in that level or that part of his work, which I think is just simply not tenable when you also take into account this notion of multiple modernities, the way that modernities become contested, and also that, quite frankly, we really do need to engage seriously with the challenges to this Eurocentric notion of progression. And I think instead his moral discourse ethics is much more promising because it allows us a sense of basically saying, okay, these are the formats for rational debates without relying on basically this idea of social evolution and modernity. But I mean, this is a particular interpretation of Habermas that also, I'm sure many Habermas scholars who read it or listening to this would just be, I don't know, screaming at their screen or something. But so I, on the one hand, you could say it's a defeat because practically it might not work. On the other hand, when you look at it in terms of academic work and the sense of, well, the power of critique, I would argue, is much more located in his notion of moral discourse ethics than actually his legal discourse ethics.
Thank you. There are a bunch of really great questions, so I'm going to pick and choose those that I think we might possibly be able to answer in the time that we have. So here's a question from Carissa Eisbrandi. Chris points out that people engaging in debate will mostly see themselves as rational, based on the assumptions that they hold about themselves and how conversations work. But then he asks the following question. So is the problem lack of rationality, or is it actually a fundamental difference in underlying values and assumptions? Right? Is it a rationality question that is wanting, or is there something about the character of the values and the assumptions, however rational they may be?
So he says that people see themselves as rational, and then is that there's a lack of rationality. Is that the problem, or the fact that they hold plural views?
Well, that is the question. That's the question to you is how you think Habermas thinks about that question. How much is it about insufficient rationality that is being used, and how much is it about the rationality being, up and running on all sides of a communicative active discourse, but where the values and the assumptions are so different, so far from each other, that even with rational discourse, they're not going anywhere.
I think Habermas would probably, but although again, I feel quite bad for speaking on behalf of him. It's kind of in a sense easier, when people are no longer alive, you just have this sense of, well, what would he say? Maybe we should ask him, but we can't. But I think what he would say is, nevertheless, that he never, that those obstacles of the lack of rationality and also the plurality, the sense of plurality of worldviews, can nevertheless be overcome through taking a route to discourse. So he would nevertheless, I'm pretty sure of this though, would keep insisting on that we can overcome this, that this is not something that's unresolvable. It just might mean taking communication on even a more abstracted level. So away from communication about where these issues are met, and then say, okay, so what are the main principles we agree on? And then perhaps work your way down. But that could solve the, the tensions, so to speak. So I'm not sure that he would regard it as a lack of rationality, because I do believe that he's such a, in a sense, believer in rationality that he believes he can overcome it in this way.
I'm going to move on to questions. And by the way, we're going to go until 6:30 for those of you who can hang on. There's a question from Ronaldo that actually is one of my questions that you yourself evoked in your critique of Habermas at the end. And it's essentially asking you to embellish on your critique. He writes, what do you think of Habermas's idea of rationality, and particularly the idea that communicative rationality might be limited to sort of a Western European context, or that you think he's too limited in thinking about his concepts of communicative action, discourse ethics, and so on, based on sort of Western European standards, and is not listening to or taking seriously non-Western kinds of communication, or thinking about the application to those settings. Please say a little bit more about the Eurocentrism you think is in his work.
I think Habermas, and this is one of the deeply problematic aspects in his work, he does very much remain rooted in a Eurocentric notion of, first of all, modernity, as I've already touched upon, but also a Westocentric idea of what constitutes rational communication. And I think a lot more work also on that level has to be done comparatively, looking at his idea of speech, for instance, from different cultural points of view. The problem is that most people who study Habermas and who are Habermas scholars, they do tend to stay within the realm of basically Western liberal political philosophy and academia, and they don't really tend to venture out into the non-Western. Nevertheless, I think, for instance, how I apply my work in Egypt is that the deformities to the sense of equal participation. So when actors, activists, and others are crushed in a public sphere, these are moments that I think Habermas can provide as useful tools. But for that, we don't necessarily need all the baggage of the social modernity, of social evolution, etc. We can just talk about the horizontal level of his theory. So Habermas distinguishes between his synchronic account and his diachronic account. His synchronic account is the theory of argumentation, and his diachronic account is his theory of social evolution and modernity. Whereas I would say the argumentation part, we would need to do much more analysis, looking at also forms of argumentation in different contexts. His theory of modernity, etc., is just outright problematic. And I think we actually, especially if we want to do intercultural stuff and apply to different contexts, we should probably disregard. Although he would disagree because he just put out a massive book whereby he actually explicitly roots it in basically Judeo-Christian heritage. So making my work even harder than I already thought it was.
I want to move to a slightly related question, actually, from John Grin. He asks, and I quote, do we in contemporary societies need any additional conceptualization of herrschaftsvrij communication to account for or to deal with the kind of diversity that, in a sense, defines contemporary societies? And then he puts it in more scholarly terms with references. He wants to re-ask the question, how do you assess Ipung, Benabib, etc., and their interventions on Habermas? I assume that their interventions are along the same lines about how intercultural communication, given the character of diversity that we have, might challenge the Habermasian standards.
I think they do, and I would also, quite frankly, I would also welcome it. And I think also it's important for any scholar and academic that we engage with, not to sort of really stick to their framework as if it's like the God old truth itself, but rather use also his notions as a springboard to evaluate other concepts. What those concepts would have to be, I'm not entirely sure, but I think, at least for my part, again, I think that there's different ways in which communication is distorted. And one of the things that Habermas explicitly overlooks is also the deep existential impacts also of distorted forms of communication itself, which then have, again, a long-lasting impact on the processes of communication. It's a bit much, really, and a bit hard to ask people whose process of communication has been distorted through violence, for instance, to then engage, to basically say, oh, you have to engage in rational debate. There's a level of emotionality that also has to be dealt with, but that also actually hampers rational debate again itself. So you become it's the problem of the vicious circle there. So I think there's definitely different concepts that are needed to deal with this. And I think Habermas merely just provides us with a useful springboard from which to examine such different concepts.
I want to ask you a question that was also raised by Tarek Al-Baraidi and that I share. It's a very simple question. How does Dr. Matthies-Boon apply Habermas's philosophy to her own life world?
To my own life world.
Yeah, let me just, in my introduction of you, I made reference to one very specific gesture, a public life gesture that you did on behalf of one of your former students. That counts as a Habermasian communicative action gesture. But more generally, how do you apply Habermas's philosophy to your own life world? That's his question, and mine too.
It's quite scary because actually I have to admit that he sort of permeates my life, whether I like it or not. And in the sense that I think the best sort of insight from Habermas is really your own intersubjective constitution, your own relation to others, but also most of all, that we never are the harbinger of truth. Like, we are never the sole owners of truth. Everything we do is intersubjectively formed in relation to others. And that also means that our academic work, our ideas, etc., it's important to not become lost in, well, in a sense, in a different kind of way, in the philosophy of the subject, in the ego. But it's important to emphasize the intersubjectivity of our knowledge constitution and be grateful also for our colleagues and other thinkers who help us engage in rational debate rather than blow around trumpets, so to speak. I think that's really, really important, especially these days.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll give you your well-deserved break. So I'm curious to know about the way forward. So moving very practically to the earlier line of questioning that both Tarek and I were asking you about, how do you deal with such hostile settings as the current versions of social media and the kind of discourse of populism and the kind of toxic, in communicative terms, the toxic quality of current politics. How can you move the possibility and the hope forward? And I guess I'm interested not in the general idea that you should keep moving forward by practicing the various kinds of edicts of in a sense, ethical discourse in the various Habermasian steps that you gave us a lovely overview of, but also in trying to get others to do the same. Are there not, well, let me ask it more generally, how important is it to actually find ways of forcing or engaging, grabbing the attention of others who you think are outside of that sort of world of reasonable differences in order to bring them back into this world of communicative action and communicative discourse? Is it possible? What is the way to engage, if it is the way to move forward is to get such groups back into the fold, so to speak? How do you do that? Do you do that with protests? Do you speak truth to power? Do you do nonviolent Gandhian non-cooperative action protest? What are the right ways specifically to engage those kinds of publics, those partners in our public lives?
It's a really, really good question, and also a really important one, and also therefore a very difficult one. I think there's a variety of different things. One, and it depends on the context, right, and the person you're talking to. One, of course, is engaging them in debate. So trying to, regardless of the irrationality, and social media is not the right medium for this. I'd say then you'd have to talk to them, face to face or in a human relation. Whereas in social media, people often just descend into screaming at each other, and it doesn't help. But one of them is engaging in debate and trying to, work hard at coming to an understanding, and also with these different groups. So try and overcome differences in that way. However, sometimes injustices are so grave that engaging in debate is actually problematic, in the sense that it should really we should really move towards a sense of protests. For instance, in my own case, I would find it, for instance, if people would have different points of view on Egyptian, I don't know, politics, liberalism, socialism, whatever, that's fine. However, engaging in direct debate with Sisi, the president of Egypt himself, who's murdered so many people, led to, even now in the recent protests, children being imprisoned, and you name it, I'm not sure that, then also honestly, debate is the right answer. And actually debate can then, and that's also something that's perhaps been under-researched, can actually, at least in the Habermasian context, it has another context, but can lead to repression, etc. itself. So we also, I think, need to understand the wider context within which we engage people in debate, and whether this leads to forms of misrecognition or maldistribution itself that then we cannot overcome after. So talking to, in this case, the president of Egypt, or, far right-wing Nazi groups, might be very difficult, also on those kind of ethical grounds, because of the harm involved to others, that there has to be a line drawn. And that's, I guess, where Habermas would also say law is important. Law provides us with, basically with a line of we go up to here and no further. In order to safeguard the rational presuppositions of debate. If we want to have a debate where people are welcome, there also have to be limits to debate. It's not a total free fall. It's also why he talks about that all relevant information has to be included. It doesn't say all information. Just to give an example, and also Jamie Waldron, of course, has talked about the harm of hate speech in the public sphere. So I think that's also an important aspect that we do. In order to safeguard communication, we have to draw the line somewhere as well on this.
Thanks, Vivienne. That was really splendid. All the answers you gave us to our questions, and especially the extraordinary summary of the work. But before I thank you again, I want to thank the audience for joining us and for the terrific questions. This will be posted on YouTube shortly on the AISSR YouTube channel, the Great Thinkers series. And I want to thank those who made that possible, particularly within the AISSR. That's Sarah Roenerkamp from the AISSR office, but also our colleagues at SPY 25. Thank you so much for helping us with all the technical details. For those colleagues, thank you, Vivienne Matthies-Boon, for a terrific lecture. So we will see you all hopefully soon. The next lecture is on November 5th, 2020, so in a month's time. And then we will be hearing from Nanka Verloo, who will be presenting one of her great thinkers, Chantal Mouffe, on November 5th. So hopefully we'll see you all then. Bye-bye.